what got you to Miami working on the paper?
Oh, I went from, actually, I worked at a student newspaper when I was in college. And then went in the Army, and they sent me to Army journalism school. Because I guess I'd worked on the student newspaper. They ask you when you go into the Army, what have you done or what are your experiences?
Right.
They sent me to Army journalism school, which is a very good journalism school, in fact. They beat AP style, it's called, into it's a certain style of writing that the Associated Press used a lot of. It's called inverted pyramid, where the most important fact is first and the second most important fact is second, and so on down the line, so that you can cut the story at any point that's intact. And so I kind of enjoyed that. I was a newspaper editor in the Army and ran around, did a lot of kind of interesting stories.
Is this for the Army paper? I can't remember what
Stars
it's called.
and
The Stars and Stripes.
Yeah.
Right?
I worked for both the Stars and Stripes, and I published just a base newspaper at the base I worked at. And then when I came back to the States, I went to work for a small paper in Missouri. Worked there for a year and a half, went back and got a master's degree in journalism, and then just because of the way, those connections from school work, our school had guys who were fairly important in the Knight Ridder organization who trusted their former teachers to tell them who was coming along, and they just called them up and they sent me a note offering to interview me, so I went down for an interview and I was hired.
Well, I was saying, I knew you'd started in Iowa, or you grew
Yeah.
up in Iowa, and then I knew
Right.
Korea, so I was working my way to Miami. And then after, what, like a decade in Miami, you suddenly went to St. Paul?
Well, yeah, I went to St. Paul. The problem was that Miami, because of the way the culture down there works, there are no taxes. And there never will be any taxes because there were too many desperate old people. And I'm not saying that pejoratively. There were just a lot of people who had retired there in the 50s and 60s on incomes that were like $100 a week, and they'd bought a small house not too far from the beach because there wasn't anything too far from the beach, and now all of a sudden they were living in $150,000 houses that they could not pay the taxes on. Nor could they move because they couldn't, because there was nothing cheaper than that
Right.
that they could buy, and the $100 a month was not going, or $100 a week was not going anyplace anymore, and they were desperate. They were terrible. They were as bad as schools could get, and there was just an ocean of drugs going through them. So my wife and I decided that we didn't want our kids going to those schools. They went to elementary school, which wasn't too bad because that was usually in a neighborhood where there was neighborhood control. And it was only in the junior highs and the high schools we didn't want our kids. So we started looking around for a place to go. And the Herald, which is one of a chain of newspapers, it was the headquarters for the chain of newspapers at the time, and one of the guys working there offered me a transfer to St. Paul. It's the same chain, so I just moved to St. Paul, and because they had good schools there.
Well, that's an excellent reason. I like St. Paul and Minneapolis very much, but it was such a dramatic contrast to Miami.
Yeah.
I sort of wondered how you did when you got to Minnesota. Was it culture shock? Must
Well,
have been climate shock.
But I grew up in Iowa.
Well, that's
so,
true.
So
it
Iowa was
translates.
really kind of like suburban St. Paul anyway. So I could say.
Well, you kept your hand in with the desert. One other thing I wanted to ask you about before I talked to you about the books was that I know you have this wonderful thing you do when you're not writing books, which is you go off to Israel and
Right.
you do archaeology.
Right. It's sort of my major enthusiasm. I would like to actually write a book on Solomon before everything is done with.
We talked about
but
that
that's-
last year.
Yeah, that's 5 or 6 years away. That's quite a way away yet before I even start. Right now I'm sort of piling up as much material as I can get. But when I was an undergraduate, I majored in American history and American literature, and it's called American Studies was the program. And then I started reading back through history, and I became a Civil War buff for a long time, and I've got a couple thousand Civil War books. Then I started reading American Revolutionary history, which leads you to French history, and English history, and then you wind up back in the Renaissance, and then you wind up back in the Crusades, and then you wind up back in the Holy Land. And I found that the Bible is just absolutely fascinating. I'm not a religious person. I'm a sort of a severely lapsed Catholic. And, but I just found it to be really fascinating, sort of the questions about the Bible. Is it history? Is it a kind of a history? Is it folk tales? Exactly what is it? Because whatever it is, it's incredibly important it was incredibly important for our civilizations to move forward. There were some basic concepts buried in there that made us develop much differently than things developed, say, in India or China. One of the crucial ones was that no matter how powerful or important or violent or deadly that a king may be, he's not the final. He is not God on earth. There is a God that he will have to answer to too. And so there's sort of inculcated in that a kind of democracy. There's an incipient democracy in that everybody has to answer to a higher authority. Order. Yeah, and that is sort of important in the way things develop, through the ages. So at any rate, it all wound up as an archaeological project about 30 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. I work with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I've always been sort of an amateur photographer. I'm the photographer for the dig.
Are you a volunteer?
Yeah.
And I think being a photographer for the dig would be absolutely fascinating.
And I help sponsor it too, the dig. But basically what I do is I go there every summer and take about 3,000 photographs, and they're not the kind of photographs you would see on television or in a magazine or anything like that. They're technical photographs of holes in the ground and objects coming out of the holes, and people cleaning stuff up.
Why are they in this particular site? Is there something of historic interest there?
There's an ancient Canaanite city called Rehov. If you see it, you're driving along this highway that goes up to between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee. It actually goes right up the Jordan Valley past Jericho. And when you get near the city of Beishan, you see over on the right a thing that looks like Moby Dick. It looks like a huge surfacing whale coming up, because it's just absolutely flat. I mean, their mountains over there are a little bit different than our mountains here, where they rise up. Actually, they're sort of like the mountains around here, where they just come out of the ground. There's just like a flat plane, and then boom, there's something sticking up. Other than that, the valley's very flat, and right out in the middle of it, there's this bump that looks like a whale surfacing in the ocean, and that's an old Canaanite city. It used to guard one of the main crossings of the Jordan River. And so what we're trying to do now is we're trying to nail down what happened at the time of David and Solomon. We're trying to nail down whether Solomon was actually responsible for much of the building activity that he was given credit for. It's a very hot controversy in biblical studies.
You mean as the temple, for example?
Not the temple so much, because there are no remnants of the temple. Well, I'll take that back a little bit. There might be a couple of little remnants of the temple, but nobody is really sure. There is a couple little pieces have come up that some people have claimed are remnants of the temple. But there were 3 biblical cities that Solomon was supposed to have fortified. That's Hatzor, Megiddo, which is Armageddon, and a place called Gezer. And in each of those cities they found, and he was supposed to have built fortifications in each of them, which involves a certain kind of military style gate in the wall. Mm-hmm. It's a gate that's very hard to get through. Those were the weak parts of the walls, the gates were, as far as attacking, because they had to have some way to open it and people to come through. So they built essentially a fortification that you had to go through to get it through the gate. So what they found at these 3 cities were gates that appeared to have been built by the same architect virtually. I mean, they were very similar in construction and style and the way they were built. And so when they were found, 50 years ago now, 40 years ago, people said, this is it. I mean, the Bible says that Solomon built these 3 gates, these 3 fortifications, and here are the gates for the 3 fortifications, all of the same style at the same time, and the time fits. Now what people are saying is, some archaeologists are saying, no, they were built after Solomon. In fact, they were built by Ahab, who was the husband of Jezebel, which doesn't sit well with a lot of people who read the Bible. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to nail down that time sequence. We can do it. Rehov may not be mentioned in the Bible. It might be, but it might not be. Nobody is exactly sure where the Rehovs mentioned in the Bible were. But in any case, it was not heavily dug over. It's a huge site, but because it wasn't a biblical site, the early archaeologists who really didn't know what they were doing, they were just sort of plundered these sites, digging holes in the ground, looking for objects. We've got this really clean site, and we're going down and we're just carefully nailing down all the strata,